You are just in time. Good morning, Professor Mehul.
Good morning, Dr. Murthy. How are you?
I'm fine.
Should we start? Yeah. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the February webinar for the IHOPE calendar of events. And today we will be having a conversation on coping with Omicron. And leading the conversation with Dr. Mehul Mehta is Dr. Murthy, who is the co-principal investigator at IHOPE. And he will be talking to Dr. Mehul Mehta, who is also the key collaborator at IHOPE. And he is the chief medical officer at Albright Stonebridge Group. I'll hand this over to Dr. Murthy to take it forward.
Thank you so much, Arnaz. So when you said the February webinar, so I was about to say the Valentine Day webinar because it's just immediately after the Valentine's Day. So of course, that day also meant a lot of people coming out of the houses, enjoying in the restaurants, and I had to wait for more than 2 hours to be served at a restaurant. So things have changed. And unlike the National Stock Exchange, which was guided by a yogi in the Himalayas as to how it should function, I'm sure many of you have heard the news about the CEO of the National Stock Exchange taking advice from this yogi in the Himalayas as to how the National Stock Exchange should function on a day-to-day basis. Unlike that, we have a scientific karma yogi who is going to talk to us, not from the Himalayas, but a karma yogi who is in the thick of all the COVID activities. Welcome, Dr. Mehul. It's a great day that I'm able to talk to you. Something like at the declining limb in most parts of the world when it comes to the present variant. And in this session, I would categorize the pointers or the probes into 4 major categories. One is the evolution of the pandemic, including the current variant about which we've heard so much. Then I'd like you to share your thoughts on the current diagnostics and what the future holds for all of us. The third category that I would then look at is the therapeutic options, the treatment protocols, regimens, and finally, some issues of wider public health importance. So if I may start with the first bit about the changing evolution, we have seen globally that there has been a change over the last 2.5 years in terms of the mortality, in terms of the incubation period gradually getting shorter with each of the variants. The wave as such is more narrow, it rises quickly and then falls quickly. And this is what has been characterized, what we've seen in the past 2 years. The other bit, which is also something associated with that, like you are a karma yogi of artificial intelligence and modeling, is whether scientific acumen today and our scientific knowledge today, using the tools like AI and modeling, would we be able to look at the future trajectory of other variants after the Omicron variant. So two bits there, Professor Mehul. One is the changing epidemiology with the incubation periods, intensities changing, mortality changing, and about the likelihood of using tech like artificial intelligence and modeling to actually predict. Over to you, Dr. Mehul.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. Thank you, Raja, Arnaz, and IHOPE for inviting me. So just to pick up on your questions, Dr. Murthy, yes, if you look at any pandemic with a novel virus, and that I think helps to explain what we've seen, a novel virus in a naive population that has never been exposed to it before, the virus initially has no immune threat or immune resistance. And that's what happened initially. So the virus basically spreads and it mutates, especially RNA viruses, in ways that allow it to spread faster. And what we've seen is an evolution of the speed of spread. That's one way a virus evolves. But with that process, what's happened is the world's immune status has also changed. So this is a balance between the virus's evolution, because it's an RNA virus. By nature, it will mutate. We'll talk a bit about that. And the population that is no longer naive, because it's either got immunity since there has been this massive surge in vaccination, or people have got infected. So now the virus actually faces a new environment. It faces immune pressure. When a virus faces immune pressure, a couple of things happen. It mutates in a way that it can transmit faster. And it also mutates in a way that it can evade immune systems. Initially, there is no pressure to evade immune systems. So now the combination of that juxtaposed against a population that has a different level of immunity. Agreed that the immunity is not uniform and that immunity is waning, but a population that has different levels of immunity results in a disease profile that is more transmittable. And that occurs in most viruses. They reach their peak of transmission, and then they need to mutate a little more to move further. And we saw that in Omicron, the number of mutations that need to occur with one variant has to be significantly more to make it more transmittable. And Omicron was this massive leap. So you find a faster transmitting virus. So you see the compression of the time of incubation period, which means that it takes fewer days to get sicker. But also you see a population that's more resilient to the virus, and therefore the disease is milder. Now, this virus, Omicron in particular, has had some mutations that make it less able to enter into the lung cells. Remember, this is not a systemic disease, respiratory disease. It's really a pulmonary respiratory disease. We have systemic diseases that start from the respiratory system and go diffusely in the system. Measles is one example. But this is really localized to the pulmonary epithelial cells. And so what we see is that viruses evolved to make it transmit faster. That's a natural evolution of any virus. The best way I can explain this is it's like an army invading a naive set of villages, right, or a population. Army comes in and their aim is to invade as many as possible. So they become faster and faster in invading. But the villages or the populations also realize, oh, the army is coming in, now let's put up defenses. Then the only way the army can, this invasion can occur is if they evade, they do some stealth maneuver. That's exactly what the virus is doing. So what you see is the evolution of immune escape, especially for antibody escape. We'll talk about that in a second. And the second is increased transmittability. This is what's caused the compression of both timeline to disease, shortening of disease process because you have a stronger immune response, and a decrescendo that's extremely fast when the virus stops reaching critical threshold for spread. So it reaches critical threshold for spread and it explodes, and it comes below critical threshold for spread and it implodes. Now, we feel that Omicron is milder. It is true because it's invading the lung cells less, so lung inflammation is less. It's more upper respiratory. But it's not milder in people who don't have immune resistance. So the unvaccinated are quite sick, and most of the hospital beds in the US are filled with unvaccinated. Immunocompromised are quite sick because they don't put up a resistance. So the first part of your question is, this is what we are seeing. And this leads to the second part, what should we expect? Now, in terms of what we should expect, it's really hard to say that the virus will become milder and milder. One can suggest that that may be the case, but we do know that mutations will occur, but the amount of mutations required to make it a variant of concern are significantly more. We can talk a bit about why did Omicron mutate so much in a second. But with mathematical modeling, which you talked about, with AI, already we know the structure of the virus so well that people are predicting which of the amino acid sequences, the nucleotide sequences, or the viral proteins, the antigenic structures, are most likely to mutate. And if they mutate, what will happen? So there's one cluster around mathematical modeling, and there are lots of papers that have come out. Everybody has their own mathematical model, and in general, they converge well. They converge well. They have a 4-month lead in terms of what they can predict. Predictive analytics look at amino acid mutations. They combine it with epidemiology. They combine it with population immunity, and they do a lot of protein synthetic or protein analysis, because it's all proteins. And then they say mathematically we can actually feel that these sequences, these nucleotide sequences in the RNA, or these protein sequences, antigenic structures in the spike, will likely change if they face certain situations. Everything is contingent. Now, will they change? Nobody can say 100%, but there's a good prediction. So let's ask the question, why do they change? What makes a situation for change occur? And one of the things we do know is that the virus only survives in a human, in a host. I'm pulling back from humans. So there are two components here. When a virus is faced with a host that does not have a strong immune response, then it can survive if it doesn't kill the host. And it has a long period to survive. During that process, it actually has a lot of chances to adapt, because the mutations come when the virus replicates. And as the virus replicates, it can adapt to an immune system. So why did South Africa occur? It's very likely that the virus coexisted with a patient with HIV/AIDS. And when the virus coexisted with a patient with HIV/AIDS, the HIV/AIDS response was blunted because there was active HIV/AIDS. And so the virus evolved. And they have actually a seminal patient there, or a bunch of patients who were 6 months infected. And they evolved to an Omicron state. Now, if Omicron had become more lethal, that patient would not have survived 6 months. So in that process, what happened, Omicron also became less lethal, but more transmittable. The other interesting theory that's going, and this is again, a lot of investigation going on, is, mutations occur through multiple pathways, but two main pathways in RNA viruses. They make mistakes when they replicate. In fact, COVID makes less mistakes because it has some proofreading mechanism. But if you look at H1N1 or you look at HIV, they make many more mistakes. In fact, COVID is mutating at a speed of 1/2 of what is occurring in H1N1 and 1/4 of what's occurring in HIV. So the mistakes occur there. The other way it can occur is when two diseases occur together and they are both replicating in the cell cytoplasm. So HIV mixed with COVID, then there is a gene transfer that takes place from HIV to COVID. Now, this gene transfer is the way some of the gene sequences have occurred in Omicron. It could be there's been a gene transfer in an HIV patient from HIV/AIDS to COVID, right? So now it's picked up different features, genotypic features that will result in phenotypic features. So based on all that, we can predict, but can we predict for sure is very difficult because there's so many factors that come into play. But what it seems like is that we are going to get a situation, if you project forward, of an immune population with variable immunity, of a virus that evolves with increased transmittability. We've already seen an Omicron subvariant, BA.2, that is more transmittable than BA.1, which is Omicron, right? We already see that exploding. And so it'll be more transmittable, and there'll be more immune pressure on it. So more immune evasion will occur. And so we will see this situation where the general pandemic will die down, but there will be these sporadic surges in susceptible populations, especially if the virus is given the right environment to spread. The minute the environment is right, the immune pressures are less, it'll spread. So that's what we probably will see, but it's going to be with us. If anybody feels Omicron is the last one, that is a myth. It is going to be with us, and we will have to, as they say, learn to live with it. So that's sort of, I hope it helps. That's sort of the overarching thing.
That was absolutely fascinating to listen to. There are some questions from Prof. I'll just take them after the next part of questions. So one of the things that you mentioned reminds me of Ukraine, Russia, and the rest of the world standoff. So Omicron is like Ukraine right now. Or the COVID virus is like Ukraine. So it's trying to fight back, have its own forces in place. Which brings me to the next lot of questions, which basically do with vaccination. Like you talked about the immune response, and a lot of it, the population immunity has been because of the immunization, whatever vaccination which we use, whatever vaccine, that has made a big change. Now, a lot of media reports talk about infection breakthroughs. Mm-hmm. Now, when we look at the way the emergency use authorization came in, it was basically tested against the endpoints of severity, hospitalization, and mortality. And one of the bonuses that you would have is perhaps transmission. But to talk about infection breakthroughs as the headline, does it really make sense? And along with that, the next questions related to the same is, a lot of companies today are talking about tweaking their vaccines because of the threat of Omicron. Yeah. If you look at the cost effectiveness, is it really worth investing into making a change with the Omicron variant? Or will it help us to look at future variants when it's a different story altogether? So these two questions, if you could just to your knowledge base.
So Dr. Murthy, first thing is all vaccine studies were done with two major goals in mind. One is what we call the effectivity, and one is what is the protection against severe disease and death. So when we first got the AstraZeneca vaccine out, or the mRNA, in the alpha and the beta variants, or even the original Wuhan variant, the first data that came out, it's over 85% effective. That means that they actually did look at how many people got COVID versus how many people didn't. I mean, that was the placebo control. So yes, that was looked at initially. So the first thing obviously is the vaccine protecting 100% against the disease? And initially, if you remember, the mRNA numbers were very high. They were close to 90% plus in the original virus, because that's what the vaccines were tailored for when they looked at the DNA sequences and the genotypic sequences. So then they looked at endpoints, which you're absolutely right, severe disease and death. And we had close to 100% protection for severe disease and death. And the numbers were very high even for AstraZeneca. Now, then you talk of breakthroughs. So what has happened? The virus has evolved. We know that. There's so many alpha, beta, delta, Omicron subtypes, and hundreds of other types which never became, variants of concern. Literally, so many subtypes. Now, what happened is two things were at play. The vaccine immunity, vaccine-derived immunity was targeted against variant number 1, but it moved to variant number 2. Simple example is that the initial immunity was targeted against let's say, Toyota car Corolla, and now became a Toyota SUV. And so it's a Toyota, they can actually understand some parts of it, but the SUV has some things that will break through. That's the first thing. The second thing we realized is that viral vaccine-based immunity wanes. It wanes because the nature of RNA viruses and the nature of vaccine-based immune response to the parts of the RNA virus don't sustain, and that's why boosters are required. So what boosters do is not only increase the immune response, let's talk of antibodies, because there is a whole host of another world of immune responses that are cell-based. So that's T cell-based. They don't wane. That's why they play a critical part and we are realizing it much more. But what we can measure is antibodies. T cells are harder to measure. They're harder to quantify. What they call, what are the correlates of vaccine or immune efficacy? The immune correlates. They're harder. We will get there, but as routine assays, we don't look at T cells. So what happened is with vaccines, you had stronger T cell response, you had memory impregnation, but you had waning antibodies. So waning antibodies with the changing virus type resulted in a suboptimum antibody viral neutralization and breakthroughs. And therefore, boosters were important because the more you boost, the longer is the antibody response and the higher it is. So both quantity and sustainability both increase. So that's why boosters were important. So the breakthroughs we saw were actually based on the fact that that is the nature of the evolution. But the important thing is that it did create very strong protection against death, not 100% or hospitalization, but the numbers prove themselves that with Omicron, milder disease, and those who were really sick were non-vaccinated. So you can see that you have a study therein that unvaccinated, you're getting severe disease and Omicron doesn't spare you. But vaccinated, you are in a very different category of disease, is much milder like a cold. So that's what we see. We've seen that in the past with coronaviruses. There's a coronavirus that's been around since many years. They label it as 229E. It causes the cold. And what they found is the same person keeps on getting this coronavirus cold. Why? And they found two things at play. The virus evolves and the antibody response to the variant that they got at once is not adequate enough for the variant that comes later. It wanes. So that study was done retroactively because they actually found blood samples from patients at that time and they had viral samples. So now they looked at blood samples and viral samples and said, what happened? So there is no reason to believe that COVID will behave any differently. It's the same family. So it'll behave like 229E, right? Multiple infections. And we'll have to therefore always keep the immune systems of the populations active. That means that will there be periodic or regular boosters? Absolutely. I think that is what is going to happen, just like we've seen in other RNA viruses, especially the flu. So it leads to your second question is, what should be the strategy for vaccine developers? And should they be tweaking it for every single variant? I think the answer is getting a universal COVID vaccine. That is the answer. What is a universal COVID vaccine? A universal COVID vaccine says that a vaccine that can apply to all the variants known and to be known based on predictive analytics. So when you do a universal COVID vaccine, you actually have to now decide what do you want the immune system to respond to. The way we've developed these more sophisticated vaccines is that we are actually AstraZeneca, mRNA, same approach, right? They are actually coding for a particular part of the viral structure to be produced by the body. They're coding and the body produces. The body becomes a manufacturing site. You're just sending in a nucleic acid code through some carrier. In mRNA, the carrier is nanoparticles. In AstraZeneca, the carrier is a chimpanzee adenovirus. They're just carriers. They go to the cells and then the cells take the instructions and produce these proteins. Now, if the proteins are not really matching 100% to the current variant, you're going to get a suboptimum response. So the thinking is that what are the parts of the virus across all its evolution, all coronaviruses? Remember, we are talking about beta coronaviruses. There's a whole other set of family of coronaviruses. Can you cut across all coronavirus families and find out what are the components, what are called preserved epitopes, antigenic structures that get preserved across all? And the best way I explain it is that, you can have an entire family of Honda cars, but it's a Honda car. You see the label of Honda, it's Honda. So is there something that is preserved across all these coronaviruses? And can you target a vaccine against that? So there are lots of efforts for universal COVID vaccines, just as there are efforts for a universal flu vaccine. And this whole approach to look at what is it that we can do that does not depend on variant changes, but that is consistent across variant to variant to really attack the coronavirus. And this actually is how therapeutics have developed. And we can talk about that in a second. Because therapeutics are not based on the variance changes, they are based on what's consistent on variants. Similarly, we need a universal coronavirus vaccine. And the person I'd like to really call out who's done yeoman work in this, and I think work that, has the world needs, is Peter Hotez. So out of Baylor, Peter Hotez's vaccine group, Texas, the state of Texas nominated him for the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, I think the Peace Prize, is that what he's done is open science. So today, the first company in the world to take his science and develop a vaccine has been Biologic E out of Bangalore. And he's developing a universal COVID vaccine based on an older platform of vaccine development. It's the same platform that we've used in the past for hepatitis vaccines. And that is what is called a protein subunit vaccine. Why? First, the science is free. The IP is free. Secondly, the platform is known. It can scale faster. And thirdly, he's attacking preserved epitopes. And so he wants a universal COVID vaccine. Now, it has to go through his regulatory hoops and approval. And, through my work, we are trying to work with him and help him because we believe this is the right path. And this actually tackles many issues of what you probably are dealing with is what we see is, vaccine inequities or the push to vaccine equity and the push to, some form of move against nationalization, because this whole vaccine nationalization has created a lot of these problems. So one of the ways to tackle this is to create a more democratic distribution, a more equitable distribution, which is driven by free science, which of course is a challenge because there is this issue of, TRIPS and IP and whether, you should open the IP up for vaccines in a situation like this. But people like Hotez, I think, are actually leading the charge.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. And two of Professor Chirantan's questions were related to that. I think you've answered that. But one question that he had was about the science around how long the duration of immunity lasts. But just before you go into that, I'd just like to say that Biological E is a Hyderabad-based company.
Oh, I see.
Atlas unit is Hyderabad-based, so it has more connectivity to IHOPE than to the IISC in Bangalore. So
I got my city wrong. Sorry, Raja. I'll bring it back to Hyderabad.
So what actually explains the duration of immunity, the prolongation of immunity? I know there have been some studies recently which have shown that the T cell response is there for very
much longer.
So would you like to take Prof. Chirantan?
Sure. So that now goes into the immunology and science. So immune responses are based on, and the duration of immune responses are based on how strong immune memory is impregnated. And immune memory gets impregnated based on many things, but one is the strength of the exposure, duration of exposure. And one of the things in a respiratory virus, when you are exposing it, let's talk of disease and vaccines separately, is that the vaccines, the disease, when it localizes to the lung, there's some systemic spread. Unlike a systemic disease that occurs all over, the exposure to memory cells is somewhat attenuated. In a vaccine, that's why you need a strong vaccine antigenic exposure. And that's the difference between a killed virus vaccine and a active virus vaccine. And therefore, in a way, an active virus vaccine surrogate, which is the mRNA and the AstraZeneca, it's a virus targeted elements of the virus, but it expands, right? It amplifies because it produces. That produces a stronger response. And then you need to always create reinforcement. It's like studying for an exam. You study once and then you have to reread it and revise it and reread it and revise it. You create impregnation. So you get this sort of curves that go up and drop with the first shot. Therefore, you need your sequences two vaccines. And if you remember, Johnson & Johnson had one, and Johnson & Johnson actually realized that they were the weakest response of the lot. Then you get the second one, the curve starts moving up, but again starts plateauing. And then we get the third one where the memory impregnation is stronger and the curve goes up and stays up longer. And so that's why the third boosters became so important. Now, obviously, when you tweak vaccine science and you actually expose it to a stronger set of antigens that can amplify, you'll get a stronger impregnation. We know those things. Those are part of any disease exposure. The challenge is that the exposure occurs to a set of known antigenic structures. When they shift with the mutations, then the exposure is going to be suboptimal. So remember, it's both the sequence of how you're exposing to the immune system and what is happening to whom you're exposing it to. When the target shifts, then it is going to be suboptimum. It's never going to be negative because this target preserves, it's the same family, but it's going to be suboptimal. So that is what we are doing. We are chasing a moving target. If you have a steady target, and that's what happens in many of the DNA viruses, this is, they don't evolve because their replication cycles are very tightly controlled. And you may ask why? Because they use our human DNA to replicate. And our human DNA, nature has built such tight controls. That's why we don't get mutations. We are all healthy, most of us. And when we do, we get diseases like cancer. And so they use our mechanism. While this RNA virus comes with either no mechanism or it comes with a very flimsy mechanism to control its mutations. And that's the reason why DNA viruses don't mutate so much. And so, you have drugs that act very well on them. So fundamentally, that's why we are seeing. Now, if you say, what is the duration? I think we've got to get a good idea that, after the booster is probably 6 to 8 months, that you will have strong immunity. And if you keep the same virus and no variant, then probably the duration is longer. But that's not the case. The baseline is moving. So then you have to say, okay, now what is the new one? And how do I really boost again? And stuff like that.
I think, again, that's very interesting. And you could actually see it in practice. When you had the initial variants come in, the 2019-2020 period, you saw that you needed prolonged exposure of maybe an hour and a half in a high-risk situation to actually catch the disease. But later on, with, say, Omicron, even a 15-minute exposure, because of the change in both the virus, the organism, as well as the individual, the innate response have changed. And I think that is very well seen as to how this change has occurred. So I think that's an excellent point. I'll just move on to the diagnostic side of it, keeping the time that we have in perspective. So if you look at the diagnostic side of it, what would be your take on the current status of the available diagnostics? And is it really worth going on with testing as an important policy because of the state that our diagnostics in? And along with that would be, what would be the value of different countries? And here I think nationalism is required. That is, when you're looking at genome sequencing, you need to perhaps look at various countries who have the capacity to actually develop that. So these two questions in terms of what would be the best diagnostic tests that we could think of for the future, just like a universal corona vaccine, as well as the need for genomic sequencing at country level.
Yeah, so those are two very important questions. And, if you remember when the whole pandemic broke, Director General Tedros of the WHO said that the thing everybody has to do is test, test, and test. So what's the value of testing first? The value of testing is many things are important there. On an individual level is to know whether a person is has got the disease or not, and the person has recovered or not. On a community level is to know what is the rate of spread, what you call the secondary attack rate in a community, and how fast is this spreading. And on a national level, it really influences policy because you know what you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with a surge, whether you're dealing with a drop, you know, what's happening. Now, in the presence of a surging pandemic, testing becomes absolutely critical because to contain it, you need multimodal measures. And public health measures can only be targeted with data, and data can only be known if you know what and who is happening. That's one set of data, testing. Genomics is another big one we'll talk about in a moment. It's actually something I'm very involved in. So if you look at the tests that exist, and let's do it at an individual level. You feel sick, you have an older member of the family, a parent you want to protect, or you have been exposed to somebody and you want to make sure you're not falling sick. What is available to you? Now, we heard of the RT-PCR. It's really a reverse transcriptase PCR. There is the PCR, which always existed, and then we had to do reverse transcriptase. Why? Simply, I don't know if people realize this is RNA, you're converting to DNA. So you have to reverse transcriptate first, then create DNA, then use the DNA to actually look at the presence or absence of what? We are in the PCR test. It's important to understand you're looking at the presence or absence of nucleotides, fragments of the RNA from COVID, and you're picking those things up, right? It's a very, very sensitive test, and it amplifies extremely small amounts. I don't know if people know the exact amounts, but I'll give you the standard PCR, like made by Thermo Fisher or made by Perkins-Elmer or any of these big companies, which we use all over the world, or Abbott. These tests pick up 120 nucleotides per 50 microliters of fluid, right? It's so small. Now, what does a nucleotide represent? It represents that the virus is there or was there. What does the antigen test do? The antigen test picks up the presence of antigenic structures in the virus. It picks it up much later. It requires a larger amount. To give you a difference, I'll give you a very simple, the Binax test with Abbott uses, which you may be getting in India, or the ones you get in India. They need 50 to 100,000 viral copies per 50 ml to pick up. So now you're talking about 100 nucleotide sequences, not even virus pieces, and there you need viral copies. So when you have an antigenic test that's positive, chances are you have COVID. You have to be worried about a false negative test because it may actually be suboptimal for that test to pick up. Let's say it picks up at 50,000 and you are 25,000. You're still moving up, right? That's why they say 2 tests, because you have to do it in sequence, because if you have a rising titer, you'll pick it up at 1 test. So the antigenic tests become extremely practical for home use. And if you have a negative test, but you still have symptoms, especially, then you have to get it confirmed by PCR because that'll pick it up. Now, PCR, when you do the test, you have one aspect, PCR positive or negative. You have the other aspect called what is the cycle threshold. What does that mean? You see your PCR results. In India, you get cycle threshold numbers. In the US and some other countries, you have to call the lab. But every test, when it does a PCR, it gives you the cycle threshold. What is a cycle threshold? The cycle threshold tells you how many times, how many cycles did that test have to be amplified by to get positive. Therefore, if you have a high viral load, you don't need to amplify it much. So you'll have a low cycle threshold. So low cycle threshold suggests your viral load is very high and you're transmittable. If you have just new remnants, no active virus that is picking up, remember it's only picking up pieces of the RNA, nucleotides, then you need to really amplify it a lot. That's when you go into the 35 amplification cycles, 40 amplification cycles. That case, nobody's infective. You just have residue virus. So you must remember that when you have recovered from an infection, the chance of your PCR staying positive is very high for about 90 days. It doesn't mean you're infected. you have to look at the cycle threshold. But a simple proxy, a very simple proxy is if your antigenic test turns negative, then your viral load is much lower, even if there's a viral load, and chances are that you are not infected. So from a practical perspective, I tell people that if you are exposed, you are concerned, do a daily antigen test. Doesn't cost much. And if you're 5 days post-exposure, you're fine. If your antigen test has not turned positive. If you get symptomatic and your antigen test is still negative, do your PCR. Okay. Then you are sick. Don't do anything until you're asymptomatic. 5 days after you're asymptomatic, go and do your antigen test. If it's negative, then you're fine. And many countries have used that as a basis to say you can go back. If you've isolated yourself for 10 to 15 days. If you are immunocompetent, if you're immunocompromised, all bets are off, okay? Then you basically have to continue to do antigenic tests. And the minute they turn negative, then you do your RT-PCR. If you're really worried, do your RT-PCR, look at the cycle threshold. Don't get worried because your RT-PCR is positive. Look at the cycle threshold. The rule of thumb is 30 to 35, asymptomatic, you're fine. Over 35, you're fine. 40, you're definitely fine. Anything under that, you're infected. So that's a simple, rule of thumb. So what that helps is that helps people, helps communities, helps schools to know. And there are different ways of doing it. For schools, they actually ask everybody here, many schools, that they test the home antigen test every Sunday night, Monday morning. And then they pool everybody's saliva and do a pooled test. So in the pool, if you get a positive RT-PCR, somebody in the pool is really transmitting. And if you get a low CT score, then you go and find out who. So that's happened. Now, obviously, we have two different test paradigms. One is practical, fast. One takes 2 days. So now you've got a development of these new nucleotide assays. Because remember, RT-PCR is a nucleotide amplification type of test. There are new ones that have come out. Harvard, for example, is using what's called a LAMP test, which is a nucleotide amplification test. Gives as sensitive as RT-PCR, but very fast, 20-minute results. So there are other ones that are out there, and they're commercially available for companies and now also for individuals. Now you're marrying the sensitivity of a RT-PCR with the practicality of a antigen test. It still has the downsides of RT-PCR that will run positive for a much longer time because it's picking up nucleotides. So now you have the NAT tests. That is the whole test ecosystem as today stands. They're very practical. They're moved from deep nasopharyngeal to lower nasal. And if you do your test now, it's all lower nasal. Now it's moved to salivary tests. So you've seen the shift is more practical. They're also looking at new ways to do very rapid salivary tests, looking at maybe is there a breath test available. So you see science moving more rapid testing. I think testing is here to stay. Why? The moment we get surges, people will test. This is going to be part of our life cycle when there are no surges and people are moving around and you basically have a very low community prevalence of the condition, the disease. I get numbers from Mumbai every day. I mean, I believe the number to, around 200 to 300 that are known. Remember, all those who are home testing are not reporting. They're not reporting it. So the real number is really 4 to 6x or maybe 10x higher. Even if you correct for them, for a city like Mumbai, the numbers are very small. So in general, when you have a low community threshold, it's not surging. You can get away with not testing. But if you're immunocompromised or you have a high-risk family member, you need to then take the steps to protect them and protect you. And then you do test if you're concerned and you're exposed or if you're getting symptoms. But I think testing like the virus is here to stay.
It's very, very helpful, Dr. Mehul. From what you just mentioned, I'll just pick one point, which everybody is worried about. Example, when you look at international travel restrictions, for the Omicron variant where, within 24 hours, things can change and you're on a flight for 15 hours or 12 hours. When you land, then you have a testing done. So when you're coming into a country, is it really worthwhile doing it twice, or is it better to do it only once when you land? And the second there is when you actually travel out, nobody is looking at the cyclic threshold, the CT values. Everybody is just talking about positive or negative. And doesn't that also need to change to be more aligned with the science of testing?
See, this is where now you're drawing me into policy and politics. Every country follows its own pathway of what their regulatory authorities tell them. The WHO sets some guidelines, but the WHO cannot force a country. Often these conditions, Chirantan says, can't escape. This is a difficult one because if you look at the science, right, what would you really want to have? When a person's entering a country, you want to make sure that they're not infective and they're not in a rising tide of infection. We have tests available. When a person is boarding a plane, you want to make sure they're not infective and they don't have a rising tide of infection. So in both these cases, you do the most sensitive test, which is the RT-PCR, which they are doing. But you also look at the fact that, is this RT-PCR infective or not? I mean, person with a cycle threshold of 35 or 40, so you're absolutely right. You do that. But that's not how things are done, right? Things are done, every country has its own mechanism. If you now try to travel to Hong Kong, they won't allow you in because China has a zero COVID policy. Not only that, in Hong Kong, you cannot get an overnight piece of mail into Hong Kong because every overnight piece of mail is quarantined. Now, China chose its zero COVID policy. India is trying to follow the WHO and saying countries at risk, countries not at risk, because that's a more rational way to do it. So actually, this is where people like Chirantan come in, because where does economics play with terms of public health and safety? And always it's a balance. So you are asking me a science-based question. The science-based answer is that this is what you do. Make sure everybody is safe coming into a flight and everybody is safe coming into a country. And so, but that's not exactly how economics works. So I think everybody is doing a trade-off. So that's my incomplete answer to a question that has part science, but part things that I don't know much about, which is geopolitics.
But that's the way life is.
Exactly.
And past pragmatic.
Exactly.
But I think that was very, very useful in terms of trying to get to the policymakers. And what you just mentioned about the need for CT values, unless that is there, it is always going to be a problem. Let me now move on to the therapeutics, keeping the time in mind. So we've had a large dynamic shift even in relation to therapeutics. And what most of it was, of course, repurposed drugs. But there have been drugs which were used for severe COVID, which, for example, remdesivir and molnupiravir, which have now been found to be very useful. The evidence base shows that when you use it in mild to moderate, they actually have a more important role. Yeah. And what is the future of therapeutics?
Sure.
I'm sure would be very interesting.
So I think this is a very good question, because people need to understand that there is COVID, that's the viral disease, and there's the body's response to the viral disease, that's the inflammatory response. And if you take the spectrum of the diseases, mild, moderate, severe, and death, right? It's the severe and death where the viral part of it becomes less of an issue or is playing a part, but the inflammatory response, what we call a cytokine storm, that's one piece of it, is creating destructive death, right? So you see cytokine storms in many conditions, and what that is a hyperinflammatory response with lots of stuff being thrown out. There's also a theory that is it more of a bradykinin storm rather than a cytokine storm? It's a moot point. Body is hyperreacting to the presence of this pathogen and creating a massive inflammatory response that is destroying the person. So therapeutics need to be divided into these two components. That's my simple way of approaching it. Drugs that attack the virus and drugs that modulate the inflammatory response. So remdesivir is a very interesting drug developed by Gilead based on the Hep C drug. And what remdesivir does is that it acts on the virus. And I'll explain to you how it acts in a second. It doesn't act on the inflammatory response. So the initial remdesivir studies were done for advanced cases where it was only acting on the virus, which was at that stage a subcomponent player to the inflammatory response. And therefore you saw some moderate improvement because it reduced the viral load, but the inflammatory response was like a fire gone out of control. It was destroying everything. So you needed drugs to dampen down the fire, to extinguish the fire, or at least dampen it down. And we know that one drug that came out commonly used is dexamethasone. And steroids are very powerful anti-inflammatory substances, so they dampen it. There are lots of, so there is a whole focus on what are the right drugs to use to dampen the inflammatory response down and allow the body to heal. And then there's a whole work on what are the drugs that actually work on the virus itself. So remdesivir works on the virus. It's a very interesting drug. It's actually a pro-drug. It gets converted in the body to an active drug. And what it does, it acts on this enzyme called RNA polymerase. It's really called RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. What is a polymerase enzyme? A polymerase enzyme puts together the protein chains. And if one viral RNA has to create 50,000 copies, every one of those 50,000 needs a sequence of nucleotides or amino acids, right? And this has to be created by RNA polymerase. It really works through RNA polymerase that is targeted at the COVID virus, RNA polymerase, and it puts in 3 dummy nucleotides. When 3 dummy nucleotides go into an RNA chain, the RNA chain is dysfunctional, right? So you're basically destroying the RNA's sequencing by putting in 3 dummy nucleotides. And that's what it does. And so if you look at the spectrum, at the severe end is much more inflammation. At the early part, there's all viremia, viral. So that's why in the early stages, the data that came out last December was very, very powerful, right? What did the data show? It showed 80% reduction in severe disease and death. It showed all-cause mortality reduced by 88%, 80% all-cause mortality. And it showed that it was agnostic to comorbid conditions. And that makes total sense because it's acting on the virus. Early disease, you have the virus. As the disease progresses, your other comorbid conditions make it more difficult, and then you get an inflammatory response. Why did so many young people die? They had died because of massive inflammatory response. Young, healthy immune system, boom, massive inflammatory response. Destruction of lung tissue, destruction. Once lung tissue gets destroyed, cytokine release, bradykinin release, the body goes into a cascading downward cycle. So that's how remdesivir acts. Now, there are drugs that have come out that also, now what's the interesting thing about remdesivir is that RNA polymerase does not change from variant to variant. So remdesivir is variant agnostic. Plus, it does not allow RNA polymerase to change, and this becomes very specific molecular biology, and that goes beyond me also, is that it really creates some what's called a stop codon inside, so it really doesn't allow the RNA polymerase to change. So very nice, elegant drug, pro-drug going in, acting really well. So remdesivir, if you don't know, is 20-minute infusion given currently inpatient over 3 days, right? They're trying to move it to outpatient. And what I see as a great promise is an oral remdesivir. So Gilead is moving to create an oral available remdesivir. That would be very game-changing, right? But we have game-changing drugs already that are out. So just to build on that vein, Dr. Murthy, I'll just go to drugs, if it's okay with you, because I think it's a good connection. So if we do know that the virus needs certain enzymes to replicate. Polymerase is one. Without that, it cannot create the amino acid sequences. The other one is it creates a lot of amino acid sequences, then it prunes it, and it creates the final virus copy. And that is a protease enzyme. Protease by, if you know a little of some biology, the protease enzyme cleaves proteins. So it cleaves that. It's a very specific protease for COVID. If you can block that protease, it cannot create a clean copy of the virus, and therefore the virus will get destroyed. So you have a drug that Pfizer has produced called Paxlovate, right? Paxlovate is really, it consists of one known protease that came from the HIV family. It's an HIV drug called ritonavir, right? So ritonavir was mixed with nimitarvir. Nimitarvir is a new drug they formulated. It's a targeted protease for COVID. And ritonavir actually boosts the action of nimitarvir. The results are very good. 88 to 90% protection against severe disease and death. And it should be available to everybody. Problem is supply. And that is one thing that, interestingly, we are also trying to help in terms of getting more supply out. This drug has one big problem. It's an oral drug. It's fantastic. I can, in this chat, say I have taken it, so I know it works. In like 2 days, you feel superbly better. Problem is, it has a lot of drug-to-drug interaction. And so people who are on statins, people who are on any form of anxiety patient, there's a lot of drug-to-drug interaction. You cannot give it. You have to either stop the statins or whatever drug you're taking, or you have to not give this and try something else. That is the limiting factor for this drug. Now, they have actually signed up to the United Nations Consortium for Medication Access, so that IP is available to all countries. And I hope I'm sure it'll be manufactured in India. And because it's so effective compared to molnupiravir. Molnupiravir effectiveness is only 30%, and in Omicron, it's even dropped further. It acts completely differently. Molnupiravir is widely available in India. It will become a very important drug, but we have to know how to give it because you don't want to create drug-to-drug interaction. So that's what's occurred in the available right now by a protease inhibitor. And I see more protease inhibitors coming out. That would be very interesting. Because I talked to molnupiravir and it's available in India, molnupiravir is interesting in what it does. It fools the creation of the viral RNA. It fools it by creating a substitute nucleic acid substitution of adenine, guanine with adenine. And so what happens is you get a mutated virus. And when you have a mutated virus, it cannot function. So it creates what's called lethal mutagenesis in the virus. The first concern of molnupiravir is that its effectivity is not equal to Paxlovate and the two protease inhibitors that I talked about that Paxlovate has. The second is that we still have to get data whether this mutagenesis is also occurring in the human cell. Is it crossing over to the human DNA? Doesn't seem like it, but it's something that everybody is obviously concerned about because it works through the pathway of creating lethal mutations. So that's molnupiravir. In the inflammatory space, there's a drug that actually is what's called a Janus kinase inhibitor. Janus kinase is critical for signaling, cell-to-cell signaling, and that creates the whole inflammatory pathway. And the Janus kinase inhibitor that is showing very great promise and WHO has just approved is baricitinib. So baricitinib is a monoclonal that's a Janus kinase inhibitor, what's called a JAK2 inhibitor. And that is showing great promise versus the tocilizumab, which we used before. The tocilizumab, acts on IL-6, interleukin-6. So that is what is great for the inflammatory response. That's what's showing great promise. And that's what we have. Now, we've got great monoclonals that have come out. If you remember, there was Regeneron had monoclonals and that worked against Delta, but it did not work against COVID. A monoclonal that Glaxo developed with Vir Biotech, and they actually went back to SARS and they found monoclonals that really worked against this preserved epitope, what I talked about in the past, is sotrovimab. Sotrovimab is extremely powerful. And sotrovimab is very short supply globally, so they're only giving it to patients who are high risk for death currently. but it acts and it actually neutralizes Omicron extremely effectively, but also the other variants. And sotrovimab hopefully will be able to neutralize future variants too, because it works on a preserved epitope strategy. Glaxovir Biotech makes it. I don't know if it's available in India. If you get Omicron, please don't waste your money on taking Regeneron. It won't work. If you can lay your hands on sotrovimab, it'll work really well. And if you can get your hands on Paxlovate, it'll work really well. So I see sotrovimab as coming out. And then finally, AstraZeneca has developed two monoclonals that work extremely well over 6 months. And this is really good for patients at high risk. And this is a combination monoclonal called Evusheld. That's the brand name. And they work in combination to prevent COVID symptoms and disease. They do not work when you have COVID. So they are the first prophylactic monoclonal that we have got.
Right.
And that is interesting because we've moved to prophylaxis now that can augment vaccines. And because, again, supply is so short globally, it's only given for patients at high risk.
These are fascinating perspectives, Dr. Mehul, because a lot of people look at the next breakthrough being on the therapeutic side. Just 2 minutes for the public health impact, and then I will open it out for questions because we're just about running over time. There was a question there from Srinivas also, which I'll plug in. So one of the things is people are talking about the move in countries like India to an endemic situation. So what does this portend for the future? And in terms of, the way things are progressing, is there a new fashion statement coming in that tomorrow you'll have Pierre Cardin and Giovanni getting into fashion designer masks? Our Jain monks had it a long time ago before masks were talked about by the others. But one can see the value, not just in terms of COVID, but maybe beyond. And it can become just like stilettos, it can become a fashion statement. So just to look at the public health issues in terms of the endemicity and the sort of future about masking and other behavior.
So I have no comment on fashion because I don't know anything about that.
You're very fashionable yourself.
I only wear a white shirt or a blue shirt. So, but I can talk about, so the endemicity, I think we are in remember India before Delta had said we had won the battle and there's no COVID. I think we have to wait until we are sure that there won't be any future surges. Everywhere in the world, numbers have dropped. And if these numbers continue to drop, we will move from a pandemic state to an endemic state. But it's very hard to make a general statement because nothing occurs in uniformity in any pandemic. It's going to be in pockets. And what you're going to happen in India is also that regions and cities will be in different states. And when the numbers drop and you don't meet the criteria for what the WHO has laid down very clear criteria, what is called a pandemic, when there's transborder transmission and all that, they don't meet that criteria, then different parts will move to an endemic state. That'll clearly happen. Are we there yet? I think time will tell. This year will be interesting. If we sustain this drop, it'll be, yes, the different parts will move to endemicity. That opens up your question about, what should be the future and what is the role of masking? And honestly, I have to share what Dr. Ashish Jha has a very interesting way to explain this. And I'm really liberally borrowing from his explanation to explain this because I find it's the best explanation. So what he says is that when you have a surge in any disease, influenza, this, that, it's like a rainstorm. So when you have a rainstorm, what are the things you do? You take your umbrella out, you wear your raincoat, and you wear your gumboots. Your umbrella is your vaccine. So if you have your vaccine, you can actually go out if there's just, just a drizzle or there is mild amount of rain, you can go out. But if you have a thunder shower, if you have like a monsoon downpour, a deluge, you'll need your raincoat and your gumboots. Your raincoat is your mask. And your gumboots are your choice not to go into crowded places. Now, if you're immunocompromised, you need all three at all times, unless there's no rain, which is not going to be the case with Omicron or with COVID. There will be rain somewhere. You don't know where. So you'll need to protect yourself. So think of your mask as your raincoat, which you really use when you find that you need to use it and there is enough happening around you in terms of your community or the community you moved into or where you traveled into, that you need to protect yourself. If you need to actually do more, then don't go into crowded places. So Ashish's tweet, I think, and he tweeted this out, I think is the simplest explanation for you to create a parallel image of how you would look at it. All pandemics, all infectious diseases are dynamic and they surge and they come down. We've dealt with a pandemic and earthquakes, right? When earthquakes occur, a massive earthquake occurs, it just does, then after that, it's not gone. You have many aftershocks. And these aftershocks continue for some time. So we hopefully have moved from the earthquake stage to the aftershock stage. We will get aftershocks and you will need to protect yourself from aftershocks. So the smart person is the one who actually looks at the environment and says, what is happening around me? I need my vaccine, because if you don't have an umbrella, you will get wet. And if you don't have a vaccine, you will get sick. People ask me, will I get sick if I take a vaccine, will I get sick? I said, you'll probably get sick in a new variant, but you won't be very sick and you'll be protected. But I can give it to you in writing. If you don't have a vaccine, you're going to get COVID. It's going to find you. There's no question it'll find you. I don't care where you are. It'll find you. So the first thing is you need a vaccine. The second thing is your mask is your choice. It makes no difference if you have a designer mask or if you have a plain N95. It's the N95 that's working. Now, even in masks, I'm wearing a mask. Really? Half your nose is out. Your mask is not really fitted well. It's not what you wear, it's also how you wear. And so you have to wear your mask in a right way. When you are in a crowded setting, you will take your mask out to eat. If everybody takes their masks out to eat, then you're done. Then you basically are exposed. So even how do you smartly, in a plane, I've not flown since the pandemic, but in a plane, people ask me, what do I do? I said, when others are eating, you wear your mask. When everybody's sleeping, you eat. Because that's the time you're least exposed. So
excellent. I think
common sense things.
Yeah, I think, that's why, you attending a marriage party and not eating in a marriage party when everybody is jumping onto the buffet is a safe policy. Fascinating session, but I'll just like to open it out if there is a question or two, Dr. Raja, Dr. Vipin, or anybody, Arnaz, or anybody else. A couple of questions, very quick ones. If there are there, we can take it.
Yeah, thanks, Mehul. I had to log in from another device. So thanks, Dr. Murthy, for the wonderful moderation. It's been fascinating to listen to so much. I had one question, Mehul, or kind of a point. I don't know if it's a question and we have an answer to that. You see, you were talking about testing, and I believe that testing has a lot of attributes to socioeconomic status because it is expensive, and I know for a fact that many people cannot afford RT-PCR testing.
Correct.
And that too, when you were talking about schools asking for every weekend testing and then get the report, that is something like if you are earning 10,000 or even 50,000 rupees a month in India, I don't think families would be able to do that. My point here is that we have airports, trying to impose the first kind of restrictions with RT-PCR, but there are so many other ways of mixing or traveling, like bus, any other form of road. There's hardly any talk about testing or checking on that front. We're just looking at a small door, but leaving out so many other doors open for the virus to come. So is there a point to discuss, is testing the only way out? I mean, when do you test? There are different definitions, or theories when you should be testing. And your rain example was such a wonderful example. I know you mentioned Ashish Jha was the one who told about this, but I think that's a very good example to even think about when should you be asking for testing, which is like just opening the window and putting your hand out to see whether it's raining or not. That's how expensive the RT-PCR test is. It doesn't tell you whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a deluge, whether you should be even venturing out. That something is not answered by the test. And I think we need to consider all these factors before we think that test alone can do a lot of good things. And as you said, umbrella, mask, hand wash are the more important tools with us at this point of time. So that's a long question, but maybe is there an answer?
No, so you're absolutely right. So many countries, and even in the US now, when you move around in the country, international travel is still an issue because people are worried of importing a new variant that the country doesn't know about. And that's what happened with the South Africa state. But to me, and everywhere that's becoming, I think will become the norm, your vaccination card is going to be your passport to move. And more, even restaurants in many countries are saying, okay, show us your vaccination card. If you're vaccinated, no problem. India now, I believe, last 3 weeks has opened up and said, you can come in, no testing, vaccination card. We want to see that proof of vaccination. Remember when we used to go to Africa, any travel, you need a yellow fever vaccine. You still need. You need to prove that you are actually vaccinated against that. So I think some basic protection, everybody wants to, I think the governments will say, testing is impractical to do at scale in a country. But if we want to protect our citizens, we want to make sure that they all have an umbrella. And that is the vaccine. And I think that is the right way to do it. So the challenge is to make everybody vaccinated. And we have a lot of holdouts with the people who are anti-vaxxers, who have, and there are two groups there. I just have to say one group is misinformed and needs to be educated. And one group really believes in every conspiracy, and that is very hard to move them. So that is the answer there, Raja. I do want to talk about one thing that Dr. Murthy raised, and I will end now, is about genomics. Very vital to build a global genomics infrastructure. We are working, through the ASG group, we are working very closely with a global foundation to build a global pandemic preparedness institute. It has been 2 years of work. It is active now. And one of the core things that it is going to do is to build genomics infrastructure. For those from Bombay who are on this call, Mumbai, know that our group, myself and a whole bunch of my physician colleagues, we got genomic sequencers into Mumbai. Mumbai had none. We got it as a pro bono effort. We got it donated. We got group in India raised money, foundations paid for it. It is in the public hospitals of Mumbai, the municipal hospitals, and it has made a sea change in terms of Mumbai's knowing what they are dealing with. Because if you are blind to what you're dealing with in terms of variants, you cannot mount a response properly. You don't know what you're dealing. If we did have genomics, I keep on saying this, early, we would have never had Delta. Delta came from Maharashtra. And Mumbai was not able to sequence it. It had to go into GSAID, and GSAID picks it up, or it was picked up at a different level. Time is of the essence here. So we need good syndromic surveillance and good genomic surveillance. You combine that, you can do it. Cost, listen, we got 6 physicians got the whole thing donated to Mumbai, including operating expenses, and we managed to get other people to raise money. If 6 of us can do it, for a city of 26 million, which I don't understand how it never happened, then what the hell? You can do it for India. We need a national genomics network. We have a very weak one. We have taken all our genomics institutes who are doing science-based genomics and converted them to COVID. It's not correct, right? Because we miss out on science-based genomics. And I just want to say one thing is, as Dr. Murthy knows, COVID has resulted in multiple parallel pandemics. In ophthalmology, we are seeing a myopia surge. In mental health, it's terrible. It's terrible, the mental health situation. And then, tuberculosis has gone out of the window, management of tuberculosis. All these other programs have been hit. So we have to take stock from a public health perspective of what are we in, what have we done, and how we can shore up all our public health pieces, not just COVID.
And underlying that, Mehul, is the fact that poverty has increased because, and then all of the other health problems. Thank you so much. And Arnaz, I'm bringing you in not only just for the wrap up, but from a non-medical sector, one question from you for Mayor, and then you can wrap up.
I have no questions. I mean, everything has been answered.
You've been with
You're putting me on
all
the
of
spot.
us for such a long time.
You've been putting me on the spot. I know I have no question. I'm good. Thank you.
For the wrap up, thank you so much from my side, Dr. Mehul, to Arnaz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mehul and Dr. Murthy, for spending, especially Dr. Mehul, for answering all the questions so nicely. It was really informative, and I'm sure everyone here has really liked the session. So thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Nice seeing all of you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks. Bye. Bye.